Hello, welcome to Off the Shelf Books on Tour. I say this about almost every book, but come on, believe me. Wrongful Convictions in the DNA Revolution. And you edited it, Daniel Medwed, and you edited, now that threw me off until I looked at the number of notes, references. So you gathered mega information, which is like I try to listen to all radio stations and read 7 newspapers, and at the end of the day, I make up my own mind. I don't need Big Brother or somebody else telling me what to think. So thank you. You consolidated it all, and you proved your points. You let us know where you got that material from. It's an eye-opener. It really, really is.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Veronica, for having me on the show.
You're welcome. I was surprised that it's international, and God bless you for now having success. If I remember correctly, in 25 years, 300 wrongful convictions.
Now it's up to 351.
Congratulations. But I felt bad for the man who died before you proved that he didn't do it.
That happens all too frequently,
Really?
Unfortunately. Absolutely. Because the average gap in time between conviction and exoneration in these innocence cases is often more than 10 years.
And they don't make it easy for you.
No, they don't. They
Don't
throw up
they
roadblocks.
invent hoops?
There are procedural obstacles, and then there are some psychological obstacles.
And papers get lost, and you have to pay to refile, and you get on the calendar, and the judge dies, and the whole I mean, if you've done 351, God is with you. And I'm sure the people, do they get out immediately, or is that another procedural hiccup?
That can be a procedural hiccup. And one thing that's really interesting, if you get out of prison because your sentence is up or because you're on parole, you have access to services. You might have a parole officer, you might get some money for reentry and other programming. If you're exonerated, the state tends to just wipe its hands clean of you, and you just walk out without anything. In fact, I had a client once. I worked out west. I was involved with an innocence project out west. We had a client who came out without pants. He just had his prison uniform. We had to go get him some pants. It's amazing. So there are delays in terms of somebody getting out of prison, and also a lot of minor hiccups.
And that has to be a cultural shock like none of us have ever experienced. And what do? Hang a sign on yourself? Yes, I was in prison for 20 years, but I was exonerated.
I know of one person who carried around the court decision declaring him innocent at every moment, just in case someone needed proof, and he'd show it. It was this federal court opinion declaring that he's innocent.
But I'll bet you that didn't satisfy some people.
That didn't.
I have an artificial hip, and when I go to the airport, I keep the damn thing in. They still, they go up and down with that full thing, and I'm segregated. And they once made a congressman at an Arizona airport drop his pants to see the scar.
Oh boy.
I don't fly anymore. But even because credentials can be falsified.
That's right. That's right. People are very skeptical of the system failing.
Gee, I wonder why.
Yes, for good reason.
What started you? What made you say, this is what I want to dedicate my life to?
That's a great question. So I used to be, in the 1990s, I was a public defender in New York. I was a criminal defense lawyer handling basically appeals of indigent defendants who had lost a trial and were challenging their convictions. Then when I got into academia at Brooklyn Law School, I started with a colleague a small innocence project called the Second Look Program, where we would investigate and litigate claims of innocence by New York prisoners. And frankly, that was an eye-opener to me. We had long thought, of course, that mistakes are made, that there are innocent people in prison. But once I began to really dig into this, it was only then that I got a sense of the scope, the scale of the problem.
More than there should be.
More than there should be.
More than we as a public. But if it ever was us or one of our kids, that would be a rude awakening.
Oh, and that's one of the things that sticks with me from this work. Now I'm an academic. I write about these topics. I talk about them. I teach. But when I was practicing, hearing from the parents, from the siblings, from the spouses, grandmothers. It was amazing. That's what really would get to you.
I would think it would be great reading for freshman high schoolers.
That's a great idea. That's a great idea.
I mean, not only would it educate them more than I was, and I'm a long way from being a freshman, but
You're a sophomore.
yeah, thanks a lot. It would give them the same eye-opening. So, and remember, we all can remember our mother saying, "You're judged by the company you keep."
Yes.
And birds of a feather flock together.
Yes.
So, if you've gone with the birds that your mother said you shouldn't have gone with, and then someone accuses you, you've already lost. Your reputation
Absolutely.
precedes you, and you're on your way to the pokey.
Absolutely.
With not a lot of help. And I think it would be a dynamite eye-opener for a I know in my high school they do an essay every year, and they pick out different topics for kids to do. I would think this would be a great one, and I will give it to my English department.
Thank you.
And ask them.
That's a really good point. This idea, most of the exonerees, Veronica, are people who had criminal records. They were already in the system somehow. And that's what led to some of these mistakes being made. So,
Assumptions.
assumptions.
You always did it.
There's the assumption and also some good faith mistakes. So most of these cases, about 70% of the DNA exonerations, involve eyewitness misidentification. Just somebody getting it wrong. And one of the reasons for that is, let's say your arrest photo is in the police system. Your photo gets put into that 6-pack of photos that a victim will see, and maybe they'll misidentify you. Not because they have it in for you or bad faith, but because they make a mistake.
Or they're biased.
Or they're biased. So the idea is, once you're in the system, there is this cross-contamination or this lingering effect that could lead to a wrongful conviction. Very few of these cases, some of them, but very few of them involve somebody who had not had any brushes with the law whatsoever, hadn't come across the police radar screen whatsoever.
Thank God for DNA.
Absolutely.
Now, I love that you wrote it out in the book, and I don't play Scrabble. But if anybody did, they should learn. You pronounce it, because I'm not even going to try. You could win the game on the first run if you could put that across the Scrabble board.
I think that's right. I don't even
How
know
do you say it?
Deoxyribonucleic acid.
Why?
Yeah.
You almost need one of those sheets with the arrows.
Absolutely.
My word. And anybody I've asked, that astounds everybody.
The word.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I put DNA in the title. Wrongful convictions in the DNA revolution.
Nobody would have picked it up.
No
if
one
you
would
put
have
this
picked
one
it. Exactly.
In,
Exactly.
No. Does it break your heart when you believe in someone and you find out that they was the bad guy?
Oh, that's horrible. That happens. Of course that happens. You'll represent somebody, and maybe, I actually haven't had this experience because most of my cases when I was a lawyer involved non-DNA evidence, testimonial evidence, new witnesses, things like that. But many of the people in our movement, I've been in this movement for 15 years now, have had that experience where you send out the biological material for testing, and it comes back not as exculpatory of your client, but inculpatory. And that's really distressing, to say the least. Oh. Not only is it a waste of your time and money, but this idea that you've been hoodwinked, deceived by someone you believed.
Do you think they actually believe that they're not responsible?
I think that's right. There's this phenomenon that behavioral psychologists talk about all the time. They call it, this is a fancy phrase, the aversion.
Another one of these?
Another one. It's even worse. The aversion to cognitive dissonance. We all like to think of ourselves as good people, and if we've done bad things, it creates dissonance in our head. We can't really grapple with it. So we tend to discount it. Yeah. I didn't do that. I didn't go through that stop sign.
I loved her so much I couldn't have killed her.
I couldn't have done it. And then you start to believe that story to protect yourself cognitively from the understanding that maybe you're not so great. So I think many people in the system who have done bad things, as a way of protecting themselves psychologically, develop that aversion to cognitive dissonance. They might believe they're innocent.
And their parents and their families would feel the same.
Exactly.
Not my dad.
Could you imagine? Your kid has been convicted of murder, rape, some gruesome crime. They're telling you they're innocent. Of course you're going to believe them. You want to believe them. They're your flesh and blood.
So many books go to a movie. Do you ever see this? I see this being made into a TV, like ID.
That's a great idea. I'm so grateful that you even think about. There are far too many footnotes for it ever to be a movie. I think it's a little too academic. I love the idea that it could be.
No,
there are some chapters. There are some chapters.
The stories are eye-opening, and they're people just like you and me.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And if it were you and I, thank God you're doing it.
Yeah.
But how many people can you possibly help? How many, you cleared 300.
I should note I didn't.
Oh, the
We have.
concises.
Exactly.
How did, how do you possibly weed out the cases that you take, and how many can you help?
That's a great question. So as you can imagine, there's a big Innocence Project in New York. It's the famous one. It's run by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld. It's been in the business for 25 years. It just celebrated its 25th anniversary. But there are lots of smaller projects, including one I'm affiliated with here in Massachusetts. It's called the New England Innocence Project, and it handles the cases throughout our region. But a lot of these little projects are understaffed, underfunded, don't have many resources, to say the least, and you get dozens and dozens, hundreds of letters.
You probably get 100 after this airs.
I hope so, because if there is someone who's out there, we want to hear from them.
I didn't know there was a New England chapter, but then I've never, thank you God, had to go looking for you.
But we're New England Innocence Project. It's right on Tremont Street in Boston. It's a great organization. We have a terrific staff attorney, Radha Natarajan, who does fabulous work. And part of the issue is that we have certain criteria at the beginning to weed out certain cases. So there's a little bit of an issue. Do you look at cases where the person's already served time and are out, and they want to clear their name? A lot of projects say, we don't have the resources for that.
No,
I'm
we want
sorry.
to get the guy out that's in.
Exactly.
Or the lady.
Exactly. And then for the person who's in, do we look at how much time is left on the sentence? If you only have 3 years left, by the time we investigate and litigate this case, you might already be out. So we'll look at life sentences or other lengthy sentences. It's a little bit arbitrary, but you have to make these decisions when you have scarce resources.
One would assume it's more men than women, but do you have any idea the percentage?
It's a great question. I don't know offhand. There have been several very high-profile exonerations of innocent women. One in particular, there's a woman named Vanessa Gathers from New York who was recently exonerated for a really gruesome push-in robbery that involved pushing an elderly man who hurt himself in the fall. And she was it's in the process of being litigated, but she was basically released on grounds consistent with innocence because it turned out that the detective had pressured her essentially into a false confession.
And how many years had she been in jail?
I think Vanessa had been in jail for 10 years, if I'm not mistaken. Wow. I might be mistaken, but I believe it was around 10 years. So that's just one example. Another famous one involving a woman in Florida, Sonny Jacobs. There was a very prominent case in San Antonio involving 4 Latinas who had been charged with child sex abuse, and it turned out that it had been made up. So there have been cases involving women, but most of them, of the exonerees, are men.
And unfortunately, black men.
Absolutely. The vast majority are African American men or Latinos, for a variety of reasons, including
Does that
racism.
percentage-wise leave the white man out when you go through your criteria?
That's such an interesting point. It doesn't. I think not that we're race neutral or race blind in our analysis, but I think the focus really is on the merits of the case. Being aware of the fact that there is a racially discriminatory impact of the system can help inform our analysis, but really we look at the individual case more than these larger issues. But for instance, one of the big problems is not just eyewitness misidentification, but what's known as cross-racial identification. We're not great at identifying other people. We generally aren't, but we're especially bad at identifying people from different races because we're not as familiar with them. We still live in a segregated society, and we have different markers, different identifying characteristics that we look for within different races. So that might be a factor. We'll look and see, was this a cross-racial case? Maybe that could suggest a wrongful conviction.
And people, eyewitnesses, and I myself is guilty, and we play a game with the kids when they were younger. We would make everybody look at one scene, and then they had to tell us what they saw.
Absolutely.
And they were astounded that everybody saw different things.
It's amazing.
And you fight over color.
Yep. Height, weight, age, all of those factors. I do an experiment in my class where I bring in a briefcase, and I have a friend that nobody knows in the class, maybe a professor from another part of campus or a former student from years ago. I have them come in, look around, steal my briefcase, and leave. And I pretend like it's a real event. The problem is I often do this class when I'm also talking about eyewitness identification, so sometimes the students know it's a simulation.
Okay.
But I try to make it seem real.
Gossip is a big thing, you know.
Exactly. And then I ask them immediately, before we call the police, I need my briefcase back, tell me what you saw. And then what I try to do is I plant subtle cues that will steer the conversation away from reality. I'll say, wait, didn't he have a big nose? And the person didn't have a big nose, but I'll sort of subtly plant that in there.
Yeah, but that's what police do.
That's what the police can do. Whether it's advertent or inadvertent, that's what happens. These unconscious clues can taint your memory.
Does it make you respect police, detectives, courts, more or less?
That's a great point. I have tremendous respect for law enforcement, prosecutors, and judges because I think the vast majority of actors in our criminal justice system, almost all of them, want to do the right thing. And there are very few bad apples who are just malevolent. Most people want to do the right thing. The problem, I think, is that there are so many institutional pressures on the police to close cases quickly, on prosecutors to win convictions, on judges to improve what's called their disposition rate, the number of cases that they go through. There are all these pressures to sort of speed up the process that mistakes are made. We all know that when we're rushing, that's when we make mistakes. And also you add in some of those cognitive biases we talked about, not just aversion to cognitive dissonance, but this idea of tunnel vision. Once you believe that Jim did this, you see all the evidence through the lens of that theory, and you might discount any evidence against it. So it's good people who make bad decisions. I read another book about this about 5 years ago, about why prosecutors might make bad decisions even though they want to do good things.
It's frightening.
It's frightening. It is frightening. It is frightening. Everyone should be frightened.
Is it getting any worse or better?
That's an excellent question, Veronica. I think it could get worse, and here's why. So DNA, one of the reasons I asked my friends to write chapters for this book, and why I spearheaded this project and wrote a chapter myself, is that I feel like the window is closing for DNA. And here's why. To exonerate someone through DNA evidence, you have to look at an old case, find biological evidence from the crime scene, and retest it with this new technology. But now DNA testing is happening at the beginning of cases. It's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. So people are being screened out at the beginning. But the same mistakes probably appear in cases without DNA. Only 10 to 20% of cases have any biological evidence that could be tested to begin with. Rapes, some murders, but the average robbery, the average burglary, there's no DNA. But the same errors that led to wrongful convictions in those DNA cases presumably appear in the non-DNA cases. So this window is closing. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this book. What have we learned from 25 years of DNA exonerations? Because we're going to have fewer of them, just because of changes in time and DNA is now being used at the front end. And what do we still need to do to make the system better? So it might get worse without these DNA exonerations.
Is there anything on the horizon as valuable and as earth-shattering as DNA that would supersede it?
That's really interesting. Not that I'm aware of. If I'd been good at science, I would have gone to med school like my mom wanted me to do. But DNA is being refined. It's ever more precise.
Specific.
Much more specific. So when this started back in the 1980s, the testing model took a lot of time.
Yeah.
This PCR model, it was called. I won't try to pronounce it because
Thank
I'll
you
mess
very
it up.
much.
To be kind to you and to our viewers, it would consume a lot of material and take weeks to process. Over time, it's taken less material and less time together to get this done. And now touch DNA, skin cells. If I do this, my skin cells could maybe be tested for a DNA profile. So it's being refined, but I don't think there's this earth-shattering new technology out there.
But in refining, hurry up and wait.
Yeah.
Isn't that when mistakes are made?
Good point.
Everybody wants it immediately, if not sooner. Put a rush on it. You owe me a favor.
Exactly.
This guy's going to get out of jail. I want to, keep him in jail.
That's right.
So and unfortunately here in Massachusetts and our lab technicians are causing an uproar in the courts.
I was exactly going to go there. You beat me to the punch. You're clairvoyant, Veronica.
No, it bothered. Yeah.
Annie Ducan. That was the chemist in Jamaica Plain at the Hinton Crime Lab who, because she wanted to please her superiors, please prosecutors, she fabricated test results, she did what was called dry labbing, she did all of these things, compromised 20,000 plus cases. Back in 2012, this emerged. Then there's this other case out in Amherst now. It's a slightly different case involving a woman named Sonia Farak, who suffered from her own drug addiction, and that led to compromising certain pieces of evidence. She took drugs from samples and things like that. But we have these problems where people are rushing to get results, to do tests. That's where mistakes are made.
Now, the Annie Dukan, how many of those, they all had the right to challenge.
That's right. They did. They did. I'm not sure what the exact percentage
and our courts run so slow as it is.
Yes.
As much as we say hurry up and wane, it doesn't always happen.
That's
the
right.
waning is longer than the hurry up.
Absolutely. And as you well know, a lot of people that are caught in the criminal justice system, they don't always have stable home addresses. It's not always possible to contact them. So there are issues with notification and alerting people to their rights.
We're almost done. Would you like to read us a passage in your book?
Time has passed so quickly. I would love to. Thank you.
Let us. We'll be right back in a minute.
I'm going to read an excerpt from my own chapter in this book, which is more of an introductory chapter that explains essentially why I decided to do this project. Before the emergence of DNA testing, the issue of wrongful convictions was largely a matter of speculation. Without scientific proof of a defendant's innocence, even notorious miscarriages of justice could be subject to second guessing by skeptics. But DNA added scientific certainty to the scholar's theoretical claim. For the first time, scholars could point definitively to cases where actually innocent defendants had been convicted. Because biological evidence is seldom available in criminal cases, DNA exonerations were soon perceived as the tip of the iceberg, a smattering of errors now exposed that suggested the presence of a much bigger problem beneath the surface. The 25th anniversary of the first DNA exonerations provided the ideal opportunity to take stock of the DNA era and prompted me to host a conference on this topic at my home institution of Northeastern University School of Law in Boston. The book, which has its origins in the papers that I solicited for that conference, homes in on two critical questions. First, what have we learned from a quarter century of documented DNA exonerations? And second, given what we have learned, how can we prevent wrongful convictions in the years ahead?
It's very well written. It's historically correct. And if you're a CSI devotee, you'll love it. It's very well done.
Thank you, Veronica. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for putting
me.
it in, and I'd like you on my side if I ever cross that line. That's it for Off the Shelf Books on Tours. Thank you for being with us. The book again is Wrongful Conviction, The DNA Revolution. Bye.